The desert sun beat down mercilessly on Jake Harrison's weathered face as his horse trudged through the endless expanse of red sand and scattered cacti. His water canteen had been empty for 2 days, and his lips were cracked like dried leather. The 40-year-old cowboy had been riding for weeks, searching for something he couldn't quite name, perhaps redemption, perhaps just a place to call home. Jake had left his small ranch in Texas after losing everything in a poker game to a crooked dealer. His wife had died 3 years prior from fever, and, without her gentle presence, the ranch felt more like a tomb than a home. So he packed his few belongings, saddled his faithful horse Thunder, and headed west into the unknown territories of Arizona. The Apache land stretched before him like an ocean of dust and stone. Most white men avoided this area, knowing the Apache warriors were fierce protectors of their ancestral grounds. But Jake had nowhere else to go, and, frankly, he didn't much care what happened to him anymore. Death might even be a welcome relief from the hollow ache in his chest. As Thunder's hooves clicked against the rocky ground, Jake noticed something glinting in the distance. Shading his eyes with his hand, he could make out what appeared to be a small settlement nestled between 2 large rock formations. Smoke was rising from several fires, and he could see people moving about. "Well, Thunder," Jake muttered to his horse, his voice hoarse from thirst, "looks like we might find some water after all." As they approached the Apache camp, Jake felt a mixture of hope and fear. He knew the stories: some Apache tribes were peaceful traders, while others would kill any white man who dared enter their territory. But his desperate need for water overrode his caution. The first person to notice his approach was a young Apache girl, perhaps 16 years old, who was gathering firewood near the edge of the camp. She had long black hair braided with colorful beads, and her dark eyes widened with surprise when she saw the dusty cowboy approaching. Instead of running or calling for help, she stood perfectly still, studying him with curious intensity. Jake slowly dismounted from Thunder, keeping his hands visible and away from his gun. He had learned enough about Indian customs to know that sudden movements could be interpreted as hostile. The girl continued to watch him, and he noticed she wore 3 distinctive symbols on her buckskin dress: a turquoise thunderbird on her left shoulder, a silver wolf on her chest, and a carved bone eagle on her right arm. "Water," Jake said simply, pointing to his empty canteen and, then, to his mouth. "Please." The girl tilted her head, considering his request. Then, without warning, she let out a sharp whistle that echoed across the camp. Within moments, Jake found himself surrounded by Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, arrows notched and ready to fly. An older man, clearly the chief based on his elaborate headdress and the respect shown by the other warriors, stepped forward. His weathered face was stern, but his eyes held wisdom rather than immediate hostility. "Why do you come to our land, white man?" the chief asked in surprisingly clear English. Jake swallowed hard, his throat feeling like sandpaper. "I'm just passing through, Chief. I mean no harm to you or your people. I only ask for a little water for myself and my horse." The chief studied Jake for a long moment, taking in his worn clothes, his tired horse, and the obvious desperation in his eyes. "You are far from white man's territory. What drives you into Apache lands?" "I lost everything," Jake said honestly. "My home, my wife, my purpose. I'm just trying to find a place where I might start over, or..." He paused, not wanting to admit he was half hoping to die in the desert. The young girl who had first spotted him stepped forward and spoke rapidly in Apache to the chief. Jake couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the urgency in her voice. The chief listened intently, occasionally glancing at Jake with what might have been surprise. After she finished speaking, the chief was quiet for several minutes. The other warriors remained motionless, their weapons still ready but no longer aimed directly at Jake. Finally, the chief nodded slowly. "My granddaughter, Ayanna, says the spirits have spoken to her about you," the chief said. "She believes you are not here by accident." Jake looked at the girl, Ayanna, with confusion. "I don't understand." Ayanna stepped closer, and Jake could see that her dark eyes held an intensity that seemed far beyond her years. She pointed to each of the 3 symbols on her dress, then spoke in English, though with a heavy accent. "These symbols chosen me when I become woman," she said. "Thunderbird for sky power, wolf for earth wisdom, eagle for spirit vision. They tell me important things sometimes. The chief nodded approvingly. Ayana is our shaman's daughter. She has the gift of seeing beyond the world most people know. If she says the spirits have plans for you, then perhaps you should stay and listen. Jake felt overwhelmed by this unexpected turn of events. He had expected to either receive water and be sent on his way, or to be killed outright. He certainly hadn't expected to be invited to stay based on some spiritual vision of a teenage Apache girl. I appreciate your kindness, Jake said carefully, but I don't want to bring trouble to your people. If other white men find out I was here, you let us worry about that, the chief said with a slight smile. For now, you need water, food, and rest. Ayana will show you where you can care for your horse and yourself. As if on cue, two young Apache men came forward to take Thunder's reins. They handled the horse gently, speaking to him in soft tones that seemed to calm the tired animal immediately. Ayana gestured for Jake to follow her toward the center of the camp. As they walked, Jake noticed how the other Apache people watched him with curiosity rather than hostility. Children peered out from behind their mothers' skirts, while elderly men and women nodded politely as he passed. The camp was larger than it had appeared from a distance. There were at least 30 lodges arranged in a rough circle, with a large fire pit in the center where several women were preparing food. The smell of roasting meat and corn made Jake's stomach growl loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Ayana led him to a small lodge near the edge of the circle. You stay here, she said, pushing aside the entrance flap. Is my brother's lodge, but he away hunting for many days. The interior of the lodge was simple but comfortable, with buffalo robes spread on the ground for sleeping and a small fire pit in the center. Jake set down his saddlebags and looked around, still hardly believing his good fortune. Why are you helping me? He asked Ayana, who was arranging fresh kindling in the fire pit. She paused in her work and looked up at him with those intense dark eyes. The symbols, they show me things in dreams. I see white cowboy coming from east, very sad, very lost. I see danger coming too, but not from you. From others who follow. A chill ran down Jake's spine. What kind of danger? Men with badges and guns, Ayana said quietly. They look for someone. Maybe they look for you? Jake's heart sank. He had hoped his past wouldn't follow him into the wilderness, but, apparently, he wasn't as free as he had believed. There might be some people looking for me, he admitted. But I didn't do anything wrong. I made some enemies when I lost my ranch. Ayana nodded as if this confirmed what she already knew. My grandfather very wise. He say sometimes running away not answer. Sometimes must face what chases you. Before Jake could respond, a commotion outside the lodge caught their attention. Loud voices were approaching the camp, and Jake could hear horses snorting and stamping. Ayana's face immediately became tense, and she motioned for Jake to stay low. They come sooner than I thought, she whispered, touching the 3 symbols on her dress in what appeared to be a protective gesture. Jake crawled to the lodge entrance and carefully pushed aside a small section of the flap to peer outside. What he saw made his blood run cold. 5 men on horseback had ridden into the Apache camp, and their leader was a man Jake recognized all too well, Sheriff Coleman from his hometown in Texas. Coleman was a corrupt lawman who had been in cahoots with the crooked poker dealer who had cheated Jake out of his ranch. When Jake had tried to expose the cheating, Coleman had threatened to arrest him on trumped-up charges. The only reason Jake had been able to leave town was because he had slipped away in the middle of the night. Now Coleman sat on his horse in the center of the Apache camp, his hand resting casually on his pistol while his 4 deputies spread out in a semicircle. The Apache warriors had once again appeared as if from nowhere, surrounding the white men with weapons ready. We're looking for a fugitive, Coleman announced loudly, his voice carrying clearly across the camp. Jake Harrison. He's wanted for theft and assault back in Texas. We have reason to believe he might have passed through here. The Apache chief stepped forward, his expression unreadable. We have seen no white men in our territory, he said calmly. Coleman's eyes narrowed. Now, Chief, I hope you're not lying to me. Hiding a criminal would make you and your people accessories to his crimes. Jake felt his stomach clench with fear and anger. Not only was Coleman still pursuing him, but now he was threatening these innocent Apache people who had shown him kindness. He started to rise, intending to surrender himself rather than put the tribe in danger, but Ayana's small hand pressed firmly against his shoulder. "Wait," she whispered urgently. "Trust the symbols. Trust me." Outside, the tension was building. Jake could see that more Apache warriors had appeared from various hiding places throughout the camp. They were outnumbered, but Jake knew that Apache fighters on their own territory were formidable opponents. Coleman seemed to sense this too, because his voice took on a more conciliatory tone. "Look, Chief, I don't want any trouble with your people. We just want Harrison. Help us find him, and we'll be on our way." "And if we cannot help you find this man?" the chief asked. "Well," Coleman said with a cold smile, "then, I might have to report to my superiors that this Apache band is harboring criminals. That could bring a lot of unwanted attention to your little settlement here." The threat was clear, and Jake felt sick with guilt. These people had shown him hospitality, and now they were being threatened because of him. He looked at Ayana, who was still pressing her hand against his shoulder, her eyes closed as if listening to some inner voice. Suddenly, her eyes snapped open. "Now," she whispered. "Now the symbols show me what we must do." Without explanation, she slipped out of the lodge, leaving Jake confused and terrified. Through the gap in the flap, he watched as she walked boldly into the center of the camp, directly toward Coleman and his men. The sight of a teenage Apache girl approaching them seemed to amuse the sheriff. "Well, look what we have here," he said with a leering grin. "Maybe this little Indian girl knows something about our missing cowboy." But Ayana ignored Coleman entirely. Instead, she walked straight to the chief and spoke rapidly in Apache, her hand touching each of her 3 symbols as she talked. The chief listened intently, his eyes widening slightly at whatever she was telling him. When she finished speaking, the chief nodded slowly and then turned to face Coleman. "My granddaughter has something to tell you about the man you seek." Coleman leaned forward in his saddle, his interest clearly piqued. "I'm listening." Ayana stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and strong despite her young age. "The spirits have shown me visions of the man called Jake Harrison," she said. Jake's heart nearly stopped. What was she doing? "I have seen him in the sacred pool at the base of Thunder Mountain," Ayana continued. "But the visions also show great danger surrounds him. The spirits say he is protected by powerful medicine, and those who seek to harm him will face the wrath of the Thunder beings." Coleman looked skeptical. "Spirits and visions? Come on, girl. I'm talking about a real flesh and blood man." But Jake noticed that Coleman's deputies were looking increasingly nervous. It was one thing to threaten Apache warriors with weapons, but quite another to dismiss their spiritual beliefs so casually in the middle of their sacred territory. Ayana seemed to sense their discomfort. She raised her arms toward the sky, and, as if summoned by her gesture, a rumble of thunder rolled across the clear blue sky. Coleman's horse spooked slightly, and one of the deputies muttered something under his breath about Indian magic. "The Thunder beings speak," Ayana said dramatically. "They say the man you seek is under their protection. If you continue to hunt him, they will send lightning to strike down his enemies." Another rumble of thunder, closer this time, punctuated her words. Jake looked up through a gap in the lodge covering and was amazed to see that storm clouds were indeed gathering on the horizon, seemingly from nowhere. Coleman was clearly losing his composure. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "We're not here for ghost stories. We're here for a criminal." But even as he spoke, the first fat drops of rain began to fall, and the wind started to pick up. The Apache people seemed to take this as confirmation of Ayana's words, and they began to chant softly in their native language. One of Coleman's deputies tugged at his sleeve. "Sheriff, maybe we should go. This place is giving me the creeps." Coleman shook him off, but Jake could see uncertainty in the corrupt lawman's eyes. "Where exactly is this Thunder Mountain you mentioned, girl?" Ayana pointed toward the east, in the opposite direction from where Jake had actually come. 2 days' ride. But the spirits warn that white men who go there with evil in their hearts will not return. The storm was building rapidly now, and lightning began to flash in the distance. The timing was so perfect that even Jake was beginning to wonder if Ayanna really did have some kind of supernatural power. Coleman looked around at his increasingly nervous men, then, back at the growing circle of Apache warriors. Finally, his practical nature overcame his determination. "We'll be back," he said loudly. "And if we find out you're hiding Harrison, there'll be consequences." "The spirits will be watching," Ayanna replied calmly, touching her 3 symbols again. As if in response to her gesture, a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the camp, followed immediately by a crack of thunder so loud that several of the horses reared in fear. That was enough for Coleman's men. "Sheriff, we need to go now," one of them called out over the rising wind. Reluctantly, Coleman wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he called back as they rode out of the camp at a much faster pace than they had arrived. Jake watched through the lodge flap as the 5 men disappeared into the desert, driven away by the sudden storm that seemed to have appeared just when Ayanna needed it most. As soon as they were out of sight, Ayanna returned to the lodge, her face calm but her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline of what had just occurred. "How did you know that storm was coming?" Jake asked in amazement. Ayanna smiled and touched the Thunderbird symbol on her shoulder. "Grandfather taught me to read sky signs when I was small child. I feel storm coming for hour, just waiting for right moment." Jake stared at her with new respect. This young woman had not only saved his life, but she had done it with a combination of spiritual theater and practical knowledge that had completely fooled Coleman and his men. "You could have just turned me in," Jake said quietly. "Why did you take such a risk for a stranger?" Ayanna was quiet for a moment, looking down at her 3 symbols. "The spirits show me in dreams that you have important path to walk." "Not finished yet." Also, she looked up at him with a slight smile, "You have good heart. I see it in your eyes when you worry about bringing danger to our people." Outside, the storm was now raging in full force, with rain pounding on the lodge covering and wind howling through the camp. Jake knew that Coleman and his men would be forced to take shelter somewhere, which would give him time to figure out his next move. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you rest," Ayanna said. "Tomorrow, Grandfather will want to hear your full story. Then, we decide how to keep you safe and help you find your true path." As Jake settled down on the buffalo robes, listening to the storm rage outside, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. This remarkable young woman had risked everything to save him, guided by symbols that seemed to carry real power. He didn't understand what was happening to him, but, for the first time since losing his wife and ranch, Jake felt like maybe his story wasn't over after all. Maybe there was still a purpose waiting for him to discover. The last thing he saw before falling into exhausted sleep was Ayanna sitting by the small fire, her 3 symbols glinting in the flickering light as she whispered what sounded like prayers to spirits he was only beginning to believe in. Jake woke to the sound of children laughing outside the lodge. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind the fresh, clean scent of rain-washed desert air. Sunlight filtered through the lodge entrance, and he could hear the normal sounds of a camp going about its morning activities. When he pushed aside the entrance flap, he found Ayanna sitting cross-legged nearby, working on what appeared to be a small leather pouch. Her fingers moved skillfully as she stitched intricate patterns into the hide, and Jake noticed she was incorporating symbols similar to those on her dress. "Good morning," she said without looking up from her work. "Grandfather wants to speak with you after you eat." Jake nodded, suddenly, aware of how hungry he was. As if reading his thoughts, Ayanna gestured toward a wooden bowl sitting near the fire pit. Steam was rising from it, and the smell of corn and meat made his mouth water. "Thank you," Jake said, settling down to eat. The food was simple but delicious, a thick stew with corn, beans, and what tasted like deer meat, seasoned with herbs he couldn't identify but that warmed him from the inside out. As he ate, Jake watched the daily life of the Apache camp unfold around him. Women were grinding corn on large flat stones, their children playing nearby with small bows and arrows. Men were repairing weapons and tools, while elders sat in the shade sharing stories. It was a peaceful scene that reminded Jake of simpler times in his own life. "Your people seem happy here," Jake observed. Ayanna looked up from her stitching, her dark eyes serious. "We are happy, but also careful. White soldiers come through sometimes, wanting us to go to reservation. We stay hidden, move camp when needed. And, Coleman? Do you think he'll come back? Maybe. But, not soon. Storm washed away tracks, and my words about Thunder Mountain will keep him confused for a while. She held up the leather pouch she had been working on. I make this for you. Protection. Jake examined the pouch more closely. It was made of soft deerskin, decorated with small beads and 3 symbols that matched the ones on Ayana's dress: the thunderbird, the wolf, and the eagle. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with each symbol stitched in different colored threads that seemed to shimmer in the morning light. This is beautiful, Jake said, genuinely moved. But, I can't accept such a valuable gift. Ayana shook her head firmly. Is not gift. Is necessity. The symbols choose you now, just like they choose me. You carry their protection, or you not survive what comes next. Before Jake could ask what she meant, the chief approached their small fire. In the daylight, Jake could see that the older man was perhaps 60 years old, with gray streaking his long black hair and lines of wisdom etched around his dark eyes. Despite his age, he moved with the grace and strength of a much younger man. Good morning, Jake Harrison, the chief said in English. I am Chief Nailnish. My granddaughter tells me you have interesting story. Jake stood respectfully. Thank you for your hospitality, Chief Nailnish. I know I've brought danger to your people. The chief waved away his concern. Ayana's vision showed danger was coming anyway. You just part of bigger pattern. He gestured for Jake to sit back down. Tell me about yourself. Why does corrupt sheriff chase you across desert? Jake took a deep breath and began his story. He told them about his ranch in Texas, his wife's death, and the grief that had consumed him afterward. He explained about the poker game where he had lost everything to a cheating dealer, and how Sheriff Coleman had threatened him when he tried to expose the corruption. I had proof that Coleman was taking money from the gambling house, Jake said. But, he made it clear that if I didn't keep quiet, I'd find myself arrested on false charges. So I ran. Chief Nailnish listened intently, occasionally asking questions about specific details. When Jake finished his story, the chief was quiet for several minutes, staring into the fire. You say you lost everything, the chief finally said. But, I think maybe you just lost things that were keeping you from finding your true path. I don't understand. Your wife, she was good woman? The best, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah was kind and strong and everything good in my life. And she would want you to spend rest of your life running and hiding? Jake was silent, knowing the answer but not wanting to face it. Ayana spoke up. The symbols show me more dreams last night. I see you helping people, fighting bad men, making Sarah proud. But, how can I fight men like Coleman? He has the law on his side, even if it's corrupt law. Chief Nailnish smiled grimly. Sometimes when law is broken, must be fixed from outside. He stood up, signaling the end of their conversation for the moment. Tonight, we have council meeting. All tribe leaders will hear your story and vote on whether to help you or send you away. Jake felt a chill of fear. And if they vote to send me away? Then, you continue running, the chief said simply. But, if they vote to help, then maybe we find way to fix broken law and give you chance at real life again. As the chief walked away, Jake turned to Ayana with concern. What are my chances? Ayana continued stitching on the leather pouch, her expression thoughtful. Some elders remember when white soldiers killed many of our people. They not trust any white man. Others remember white traitors who dealt fairly with us. They judge by individual, not by skin color. And, what do the symbols tell you? Symbols say tonight is very important. Your words must come from heart, not from fear. She tied off a thread and looked up at him. Also, you must be willing to make sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? I not know yet. But, spirits always ask for something in return for their help. Jake spent the rest of the day observing life in the Apache camp and trying to prepare for the evening council meeting. Several of the younger Apache men approached him during the day, curious about his horse and his weapons. They seemed impressed with Thunder's intelligence and stamina, and Jake found himself sharing stories about his life as a rancher. One young warrior named Kiva was particularly friendly. He spoke excellent English and explained that he had lived near a trading post for several years as a child. "Most white men who come here are either soldiers wanting to fight us or settlers wanting our land," Kiva said as they sat watching Thunder graze near the stream. "You are first one to come asking for help instead of demanding submission. I never wanted to cause problems for your people," Jake said honestly. "Maybe that is why Ayana's symbols chose you," Kiva replied thoughtfully. "She has special gift for seeing people's true nature." As the sun began to set, Jake felt his nervousness increasing. Everything depended on the council's decision. If they voted against him, he would be back to running across the desert with no clear destination and no hope for a future. Ayana approached as he was grooming Thunder, the finished leather pouch in her hands. "It's time," she said simply. The council meeting was held around the large central fire, with all the adult members of the tribe forming a circle. Jake found himself sitting between Ayana and Chief Nailnish, facing the other tribal leaders. There were about 15 men and women in the council, ranging in age from young adults to elderly grandparents. The meeting began with traditional prayers and the passing of a sacred pipe. Jake was included in this ritual, which he took as a positive sign. Then, Chief Nailnish stood and recounted Jake's story to the assembled council, speaking in Apache but occasionally translating key points into English for Jake's benefit. When the chief finished, the debate began. Jake couldn't understand most of what was said, but he could read the emotions on people's faces. Some council members seemed sympathetic, while others appeared skeptical or even hostile. An elderly woman with intricate tattoos covering her arms spoke at length, her voice passionate and occasionally angry. Chief Nailnish translated quietly for Jake. "She speaks of her husband, killed by white soldiers 10 years ago. She says helping you could bring more soldiers to our camp." A middle-aged man countered her arguments, gesturing toward Jake respectfully. "He says you show respect for our ways and that running from corrupt law is something Apache people understand well." The debate continued for over an hour, with various council members expressing their views. Jake noticed that the younger warriors seemed more inclined to help him, while some of the older members remained suspicious. Finally, Chief Nailnish called for quiet and asked Jake to speak for himself. Jake stood slowly, his heart pounding. He looked around the circle at the faces watching him, some curious, some skeptical, some hopeful. "I know I have no right to ask for your help," he began. "I'm a stranger who has brought danger to your peaceful camp. But I want you to know that your granddaughter Ayana has already saved my life, not just from Sheriff Coleman, but from something worse, from giving up on myself." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "When my wife died, I lost my purpose. I thought maybe it would be better if I just disappeared into the desert and never bothered anyone again. But Ayana showed me that maybe there's still something I'm supposed to do with my life." Jake looked directly at the elderly woman who had spoken against him. "I can't bring back your husband or undo the harm that other white men have caused your people. But I can promise you this: if you help me, I will use that help to fight against corrupt men like Coleman who prey on innocent people." "And how would you do this?" asked one of the younger council members. "I don't know yet," Jake admitted honestly. "But I have evidence of Coleman's corruption hidden back in Texas. If I could get to it safely and present it to honest authorities, maybe I could put him in prison where he belongs." Ayana stood up beside him. "The symbols show me visions of Jake Harrison bringing justice to many people, not just himself. They show him protecting those who cannot protect themselves." She held up the leather pouch she had made. "I offer to share my protection symbols with him. This has never been done with white man before, but spirits say is necessary." A murmur of surprise ran through the council. Apparently, what Ayana was proposing was unprecedented. Chief Nailnish spoke to his granddaughter in Apache, his tone questioning. She responded firmly, touching each of her 3 symbols as she spoke. "She says the Thunderbird gave her vision of great storm coming to all the territory," the chief translated. "Good people and bad people will be tested.
She believes Jake Harrison is meant to be protector during this storm.
The elderly woman who had opposed helping Jake stood up again. She spoke directly to Ayanna for several minutes, her voice serious but no longer angry. She asks Ayanna if she is willing to stake her own honor on this white man's character. Chief Nailnish explained.
If he betrays our trust, Ayanna will share in his shame. Without hesitation, Ayanna nodded. I stake my honor on Jake Harrison. The council fell silent.
Jake was overwhelmed by this young woman's faith in him, especially since she had known him for less than 2 days.
Chief Nailnish called for the vote. One by one, the council members stood to indicate their decision.
To Jake's amazement, even the elderly woman who had opposed him stood up in the end, swayed apparently by Ayanna's willingness to stake her reputation on his character. The vote was unanimous in favor of helping him. As the formal meeting concluded, Ayanna approached Jake with the leather pouch.
Now comes the ceremony, she said.
You must accept the symbols freely, knowing they will change your life forever.
What do you mean?
The symbols bring power, but also responsibility. Once you carry them, you cannot run away from people who need help. You cannot ignore suffering when you have power to stop it. Jake looked at the beautifully crafted pouch, understanding that this was the sacrifice Ayanna had mentioned, his freedom to live only for himself.
I accept, he said solemnly.
Ayanna smiled and placed the pouch in his hands. As soon as he touched it, Jake felt a strange tingling sensation, as if electricity was running through his fingers.
Wear it always, Ayanna instructed.
And, remember, Thunderbird for sky power, Wolf for earth wisdom, Eagle for spirit vision.
Each one will help you when you need it most.
As Jake tied the pouch to his belt, he noticed that the 3 symbols on Ayanna's dress seemed to glow faintly in the firelight. Whether it was a trick of the light or something more supernatural, he couldn't say, but he felt a profound change taking place within himself. The overwhelming grief and purposelessness that had driven him into the desert was being replaced by something else, a sense of destiny, of responsibility, of power he had never felt before.
Chief Nailnish approached them as the council members began to disperse.
Tomorrow we begin planning how to help you reclaim your life and fight the corruption that chases you. But, tonight, rest and let the symbols settle into your spirit. As Jake returned to his lodge, he felt the leather pouch warm against his side. For the first time in years, he was looking forward to tomorrow instead of dreading it. But neither he nor Ayanna could know that Coleman had not given up his pursuit. At that very moment, the corrupt sheriff was camped just 20 miles away, planning a return to the Apache settlement with reinforcements and a very different strategy. The real test of the symbol's power was still to come. 3 days after the council meeting, Jake was beginning to feel like he might actually have a future again. Chief Nailnish had shared detailed plans for getting him safely back to Texas to retrieve the evidence against Coleman, while several of the younger warriors had volunteered to escort him partway across the desert. Jake had also been learning about Apache ways from Kiva and the other men. They taught him how to track silently, how to read signs in the desert, and how to move without leaving obvious traces. These skills, they explained, would be crucial for avoiding Coleman and his men. Most importantly, Jake was beginning to understand the power of the 3 symbols Ayanna had shared with him. The leather pouch seemed to warm against his side whenever danger was approaching, and he found himself noticing details in his surroundings that he had never seen before, the way birds changed their flight patterns when strangers approached, how the wind carried scents that could tell him about people and animals miles away. Ayanna explained that these were gifts from the wolf symbol, which represented earth wisdom. When you truly listen to the land, she said, it will tell you everything you need to know. Jake was also experiencing what Ayanna called sky power from the Thunderbird symbol. Twice during his stay, he had known with absolute certainty that storms were coming hours before any clouds appeared. More strangely, he seemed to be developing an almost supernatural ability to sense people's emotions and intentions. The eagle symbol's spirit vision was the most mysterious of the 3 powers. Ayanna had warned him that it would manifest only in times of great need, allowing him to see beyond the normal world into the realm of possibilities and spiritual truth. On the 4th morning of his stay, Jake woke to find Ayanna sitting by his lodge with an expression of deep concern on her face.
Bad news, he asked, immediately alert.
The symbols speak to me in dreams again, she said quietly.
Coleman comes back today, but not alone. He brings many men, and they plan violence.
Jake felt the familiar warmth of the leather pouch against his side, confirming Ayana's vision.
How many men? 20, maybe more.
He tells them we are hostile Apache who attacked his patrol. Now they come to punish us.
Jake's blood ran cold. This is my fault.
I have to leave immediately, draw them away from here.
No, Ayana said firmly. It's too late for that.
Besides, symbols show me that running will not solve this.
Coleman will keep hunting you and making innocent people suffer until he is stopped permanently.
But your people could be killed because of me. Ayana stood up, her young face set with determination that reminded Jake of her grandfather. My people have survived worse than corrupt sheriff. We know how to fight when fighting is necessary. As if summoned by her words, Chief Nailnish appeared along with Kiva and several other warriors. The old chief's face was grim but resolute.
Scouts report dust cloud from east, he said without preamble.
Large group of riders moving fast toward our position.
How long do we have?
Jake asked. 2 hours, maybe less, Kiva replied.
They know exactly where we are. Someone guided them.
Jake felt sick with guilt and anger. Not only had Coleman returned, but he had somehow convinced other men to join what was essentially a massacre of innocent people. Chief, please let me ride out and surrender to them, Jake said desperately.
This doesn't have to end in bloodshed. You think Coleman will be satisfied with just you? Chief Nailnish asked.
He has already lied to these men about us attacking his patrol. He needs to complete that lie with our deaths, or his story falls apart.
Ayana nodded agreement.
Also, symbols show me that this fight is about more than just you.
Coleman represents corruption that spreads like poison. If he succeeds here, he will grow bolder and hurt many more people.
Jake looked around at the Apache camp, where people were already beginning to make preparations for the coming conflict. Women were gathering the children and moving them to safer positions, while warriors were checking their weapons and discussing defensive strategies.
What do you need me to do?
Jake asked. The symbols chose you for a reason, Ayana said.
Trust them to show you when time comes.
The next 2 hours passed with agonizing slowness. Jake helped with the defensive preparations as much as he could, but he felt useless compared to the efficient Apache warriors who had been preparing for such conflicts their entire lives. The camp was situated in a natural defensive position between two large rock formations, with only one main approach from the east. The Apache had quickly constructed barriers of rocks and fallen logs to create firing positions, while their best archers took positions on the high ground. As the distant dust cloud grew larger, Jake found himself standing beside Ayana at the main defensive line. She had painted her face with traditional war paint and carried a bow nearly as tall as herself, but her 3 symbols seemed more prominent than ever, almost glowing against her dark skin.
Are you scared? Jake asked quietly.
Yes, she admitted. But symbols give me courage. They remind me that some things worth fighting for, even if fighting is dangerous. Jake touched the leather pouch at his side and felt an immediate surge of calm determination. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, he felt truly ready for whatever was coming. The enemy riders appeared around a bend in the canyon, and Jake counted at least 25 men. Coleman rode at their head, along with his 4 original deputies, but the rest appeared to be hastily recruited civilians, probably told they were participating in a legitimate law enforcement action against hostile Indians. The group halted about 200 yards from the Apache defensive positions, clearly surprised by the organized resistance they were facing. Coleman rode forward alone, stopping within shouting distance.
This is Sheriff Coleman of Brewster County, Texas, he called out.
We're here on official business to apprehend a dangerous fugitive and punish the Indians who have been harboring him. Chief Nailnish stepped into view, his rifle held casually but ready. You bring army to capture one man, he called back. Must be very dangerous criminal. Jake Harrison is wanted for theft, assault, and now for inciting Indian attacks on lawful peace officers, Coleman shouted. Surrender him immediately, and we might consider showing mercy to the rest of you.
Jake started to step forward, but Ayanna caught his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Let grandfather handle this."
"Your story has many holes, Sheriff," Chief Nailnish replied loudly enough for all of Coleman's men to hear.
"If this Jake Harrison's so dangerous, why you need lies to recruit your posse?"
Some of the civilian riders began to look uncomfortable, glancing at each other with uncertainty.
Coleman's face reddened with anger.
"I don't have to explain myself to a bunch of savage Indians. You have 5 minutes to send out Harrison, or we'll come in shooting." "Then, you come shooting," Chief Nailnish said calmly. "But, know that Apache warriors not die easy, and your men will learn true cost of following corrupt leader."
Jake could see the doubt spreading through Coleman's force.
Several of the civilian riders were clearly having second thoughts about what they had signed up for. Coleman apparently sensed this too, because he suddenly drew his pistol and fired a shot into the air.
"That's enough talking," he yelled.
"These Indians are harboring a criminal, and they've just threatened lawful officers.
Attack!"
But only Coleman's 4 original deputies responded to his command. The civilian riders remained motionless, clearly unwilling to attack what was obviously a defensive position held by families protecting their children.
"What are you waiting for?"
Coleman screamed at his reluctant posse. "I told you these Indians attacked us first." One of the civilian riders, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, spurred his horse forward.
"Sheriff, I don't see any evidence that these people attacked anybody. They're just defending their camp."
"That's right," called another rider. "This doesn't look like police work to me.
This looks like a massacre." Coleman's face went purple with rage.
"You men signed on to support law and order."
"I'm giving you a direct order to attack."
"And I'm giving you a direct order to go to hell," the weathered-faced rider replied.
"Come on, boys. We were lied to. Time to go home." To Coleman's obvious horror, more than half of his force began to turn their horses around and ride away.
Within minutes, he was left with only his 4 original deputies and 3 other men who appeared to be professional gunmen rather than concerned citizens. Jake felt the symbol's power surging through him as he watched Coleman's support collapse. The Thunderbird symbol was filling him with sky power that allowed him to sense the corrupt sheriff's growing desperation and rage. The wolf symbol gave him earth wisdom that showed him exactly how to turn this situation to his advantage.
"Now," Ayanna whispered beside him. "Now the eagle vision comes."
Jake stepped forward into clear view of Coleman and his remaining men. As he did so, he felt a strange shift in his consciousness, as if he was seeing the world from a great height. Everything became crystal clear, not just the immediate situation, but the connections that led to this moment and the possibilities that stretched out into the future.
"Coleman,"
Jake called out.
"This is between you and me. Let's settle it like men instead of hiding behind your badges."
The corrupt sheriff's eyes locked onto Jake with a mixture of triumph and hatred.
"There you are, you thieving bastard. Finally, ready to face justice?"
"I'm ready to face you," Jake replied.
"But not your justice. Real justice."
Jake began walking toward Coleman, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol but not drawing it. As he moved, he felt the power of all 3 symbols flowing through him like electricity.
"I know what you're thinking, Coleman," Jake called out, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air.
"You're thinking that if you kill me here, you can claim I was resisting arrest and these Apache folks were helping me.
That'll justify everything you've done."
Coleman's hand moved toward his gun, but something in Jake's steady approach made him hesitate.
"But here's what you don't know," Jake continued, still walking forward.
"I sent letters to the federal marshal's office and the territorial governor before I ever left Texas.
Letters detailing your corruption, with copies of the evidence I have against you."
This was a bluff, but Jake could see from Coleman's expression that it was effective. "Even if you kill me today," Jake went on, "those letters are already working their way through the system. Your days of hiding behind a crooked badge are numbered." Coleman finally drew his gun, but his hand was shaking with anger and fear.
"You're lying." "Am I?" Jake asked, continuing his steady approach.
Why don't you ask yourself why a federal marshal hasn't been by to check on your activities lately?
Think they might be getting suspicious about reports coming out of your county?
Jake was now only about 50 feet from Coleman and could see sweat beading on the corrupt sheriff's face despite the cool morning air. "Last chance, Coleman," Jake said, his voice calm and steady. "Right away now, and maybe you can disappear before the federal authorities catch up with you. Stay and fight, and I guarantee this ends badly for you." Coleman looked around at his remaining men, clearly hoping for support, but Jake could see doubt in their faces too. The combination of Jake's confident demeanor and his claims about federal involvement were undermining whatever loyalty Coleman had managed to buy from them.
"You think you can intimidate me with your Indian magic and tall tales?" Coleman snarled, raising his pistol. Jake felt the eagle vision showing him Coleman's intentions a split second before the corrupt sheriff acted. Without conscious thought, Jake dropped and rolled to his left just as Coleman's gun roared. The bullet passed harmlessly through the space where Jake had been standing. Before Coleman could fire again, Jake came up out of his roll with his own pistol drawn. The movement was so fluid and fast that it seemed almost supernatural to the watching men. "Don't make me kill you, Coleman," Jake said quietly, his gun trained steadily on the sheriff's chest. But Coleman was beyond reason now, consumed by rage and desperation. He tried to bring his pistol around for another shot, but Jake's enhanced reflexes and vision allowed him to see the movement beginning before Coleman had fully committed to it. Jake's shot was clean and precise, hitting Coleman in the shoulder and spinning him off his horse. The corrupt sheriff hit the ground hard, his gun flying away into the dust. Before any of Coleman's remaining men could react, they found themselves surrounded by Apache warriors who had used the distraction of the confrontation to move into position. It was over without another shot being fired. Jake approached the fallen sheriff, his gun still drawn but pointed down. Coleman was clutching his wounded shoulder, his face pale with shock and pain. "This isn't over, Harrison," Coleman gasped. "You think those Indians can protect you forever?"
"I don't need them to protect me anymore," Jake replied calmly. "The symbols have shown me who I really am and what I'm supposed to do with my life." He looked down at the corrupt lawman who had made his life miserable and driven him into the desert. Instead of the hatred he expected to feel, Jake found only pity. "The Apache people saved my life, Coleman. Not just from you, but from myself. They showed me that running away from corruption doesn't solve anything. You have to stand up and fight it." Chief Nailnish approached with several warriors, having secured Coleman's remaining men without resistance. "What do you want to do with them?" the chief asked Jake. Jake looked around at the defeated men, then at the Apache warriors who had risked everything to help him. Finally, his gaze settled on Ayanna, who was watching him with pride and expectation. "We're going to do something that Coleman never would have done," Jake said finally. "We're going to deliver him to real justice." Jake turned to address Coleman's surviving deputies and hired guns. "Any of you men who want to ride away and never come back to Apache territory, you're free to go. But if I ever hear of you bothering innocent people again, I'll come looking for you." Most of the men took the offer gratefully, mounting their horses and riding away without a backward glance. Jake knelt down beside Coleman, who was still bleeding from his shoulder wound. "Here's what's going to happen, Sheriff. We're going to patch you up, and then I'm going to escort you back to the territorial capital. I'm going to present my evidence against you to the federal marshal, and you're going to confess to your crimes." "Like hell I will," Coleman spat. Jake smiled grimly. "Oh, I think you will. You see, the alternative is that I leave you here in the desert to explain to the Apache people why you brought an armed gang to attack their families. I don't think they'll be as merciful as I am." Coleman looked around at the circle of Apache warriors and seemed to realize for the first time just how completely he had been defeated. "You can't prove anything," he said weakly. Jake reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a thick envelope. "Actually, I can prove everything. Those letters I mentioned? They were real. And this contains copies of every piece of evidence I have against you and your accomplices." Coleman's face went white as he realized that his worst fears were coming true. "The symbols have shown me my path," Jake continued. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life hunting down corrupt men like you and bringing them to justice.
And I'm going to have some very powerful allies helping me.
As if to emphasize his point, thunder rumbled across the clear sky, and a hawk cried overhead.
Coleman shrank back as if the very elements were arrayed against him.
Jake stood up and looked around at his Apache friends, feeling a deep gratitude that words couldn't express. They had not only saved his life, but they had shown him who he was meant to become.
"Thank you," he said simply to Chief Nailnish and Ayanna.
"Thank the symbols," Ayanna replied with a smile.
"They chose well."
As Jake prepared to begin the long journey back to civilization with his prisoner, he touched the leather pouch at his side and felt the warm presence of the thunderbird, wolf, and eagle. He was no longer a broken man running from his past. He was a warrior with a purpose, ready to fight for justice wherever it was needed.
The symbols had indeed chosen well.
6 months later, Jake Harrison rode back into the Apache camp where his life had been transformed. The journey to the territorial capital had been successful. Coleman was now serving 20 years in federal prison for corruption, fraud, and conspiracy. 3 other corrupt officials had been arrested based on evidence Jake had provided, and the crooked gambling operation that had cost him his ranch had been shut down permanently. But the victory had come at a cost that Jake was still learning to accept. He found Ayanna sitting by the stream where he had first watered Thunder, but something was different about her. She seemed smaller, more fragile, and the 3 symbols on her dress no longer seemed to glow with their former intensity. "You came back," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I promised I would," Jake replied, dismounting from Thunder and sitting beside her on the grassy bank.
"How are you feeling?"
Ayanna touched the symbols on her dress, and Jake noticed that her hand trembled slightly.
"The medicine man says I will be fine."
Sharing the symbol's power was always dangerous, but necessary. Jake felt a stab of guilt that had been eating at him for months. When Ayanna had given him the protective symbols, she had failed to mention that doing so would weaken her own connection to their power. It was only after he had left that Chief Nailnish had explained the full price of her generosity.
"You should have told me," Jake said quietly. "Would you have accepted the symbols if you knew?" Ayanna asked. Jake considered this honestly. "Probably not." "Then, I did right thing.
The spirit showed me that your path was more important than my comfort." Over the past months, Jake had used the symbol's power to track down 3 more corrupt officials and several gangs of outlaws who had been terrorizing small communities across the territory. He had become something of a legend, a mysterious cowboy who seemed to appear whenever justice was needed and disappear once the guilty were brought to account. But each use of the symbol's power had taken a toll on Ayanna, even from a distance. The spiritual connection between them meant that she shared the burden of the supernatural abilities she had granted him. "I've been thinking," Jake said carefully.
"Maybe it's time for me to return the symbols to you." Ayanna shook her head firmly. "Is not possible. Once shared in the way we did them, they cannot be taken back."
"But, also," she looked at him with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her years, "your work is not finished."
"What do you mean?"
"I still have dreams, even with weakened power.
Dark times coming to this territory. Army wants to force all Apache people onto reservations.
Government men come with papers and promises, but spirits show me they plan betrayal." Jake felt the familiar warming of the leather pouch at his side, confirming what Ayanna was telling him.
"When?" "Soon. Maybe weeks, maybe months.
But inevitable unless someone with power to cross between white and Apache worlds can find different path." Jake understood what she was suggesting, but the idea frightened him.
"You want me to try to negotiate between the army and the Apache tribes?" "Not negotiate," Ayanna said.
"Fight. But fight with wisdom, not just weapons. Use symbols' power to expose corruption and lies before they lead to war."
"And if I fail?" Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, watching the water flow over the smooth stones in the streambed.
"If you fail, my people will probably be destroyed or driven from our homeland."
"If you succeed."
She turned to look at him with a smile that reminded him of the fearless girl who had first saved his life. "If you succeed, maybe Apache and white people can find way to live in peace." Jake spent the next 2 weeks in the camp, reconnecting with the people who had become like family to him and learning more about the political situation brewing across the territory. The news was not encouraging. A new military commander, General Morrison, had been assigned to the region with orders to solve the Indian problem once and for all. Morrison was known for his harsh methods and his belief that Native Americans were obstacles to civilization that needed to be removed by any means necessary. At the same time, corrupt territorial politicians were conspiring with land speculators to claim Apache territory for mining and cattle ranching. They were spreading false stories about Apache raids and attacks to justify military action against peaceful tribes. "It's the same pattern I saw with Coleman," Jake explained to Chief Nailnish during one of their evening conversations. "Create a crisis, use it to justify extreme measures, then profit from the chaos." "And you think your symbols can stop this?" the chief asked. "I think they can expose the truth before it's too late to prevent a war," Jake replied. "But I'll need help from people who understand both the white and Apache worlds." Kiva, who had become Jake's closest friend among the younger warriors, volunteered immediately. "I can pass for Mexican trader in most white towns," he said. "People talk freely around traders, think we not important enough to be spies." 2 other young Apache men also volunteered to help, along with an older woman named Nayeli who had spent years working as a translator at various army posts. Together, they formed a small network of intelligence gatherers who could move between the two communities without raising suspicion. Their investigations over the following month revealed a conspiracy even more extensive than Jake had imagined. General Morrison was indeed planning a massive military campaign against the Apache tribes, but he was being fed false intelligence by territorial officials who had financial interests in claiming Apache lands. The breakthrough came when Nayeli discovered that Morrison's chief scout, a man named Briggs, was taking money from land speculators to exaggerate the threat posed by Apache warriors. Briggs was providing Morrison with inflated estimates of Apache fighting strength and fabricated reports of planned attacks. "If we can expose Briggs and his allies before Morrison launches his campaign," Jake explained to the assembled Apache council, "we might be able to prevent the war entirely." "And how do we do this?" asked Chief Nailnish. Jake touched the symbols at his side, feeling their power flowing through him. "The same way we stopped Coleman. We gather evidence, and then we present it to someone with the authority and integrity to act on it." The plan they developed was ambitious and dangerous. Jake and his team would need to gather documentary evidence of the conspiracy while avoiding detection by Morrison's security forces. Then, they would have to get that evidence to the territorial governor and federal officials in Washington before Morrison's campaign began. The most dangerous part of the plan fell to Jake himself. Using his growing reputation as a mysterious enforcer of justice, he would need to get close enough to Briggs to catch the corrupt scout in the act of taking bribes or fabricating intelligence reports. This required Jake to use the eagle vision more extensively than ever before. For 3 days and nights, he fasted and meditated, allowing the spiritual power of the symbol to expand his consciousness beyond normal human limits. When he emerged from the trance, Jake's eyes held a new depth that made even Chief Nailnish step back in respect. "I have seen the pattern," Jake announced. "Briggs meets with his corrupt allies every new moon at an abandoned mining camp 50 miles north of here. Their next meeting is in 4 days. The night of the new moon found Jake hidden in the rocks above the abandoned mining camp, watching as 5 men gathered around a small campfire. Briggs was there, along with 2 territorial officials Jake recognized from his previous investigations and 2 men he didn't know but who had the look of professional gunmen. Using the wolf symbol's earth wisdom, Jake was able to move silently close enough to hear their conversation clearly. What he heard made his blood run cold. The conspiracy was even worse than he had suspected. Not only were they planning to provoke a war with the Apache, but they intended to use that war as cover for eliminating several honest officials who were getting too close to the truth about their land schemes. "Morrison's campaign will begin in 2 weeks, one of the territorial officials was saying. "Once the fighting starts, a lot of people are going to die in the confusion. Some of them might even be federal investigators who've been asking too many questions." Briggs laughed coldly. "Amazing how dangerous the frontier can be. Stray bullets, Apache raids, accidents in the desert, so many ways for troublesome people to disappear." Jake felt the Thunderbird symbol filling him with sky power as his anger built. These men weren't just corrupt, they were planning mass murder to cover their crimes. He spent the next hour documenting everything he heard, memorizing names, dates, and details of the conspiracy. When the meeting broke up, Jake used his enhanced abilities to follow each man back to his base, gathering even more intelligence about their plans and allies. By the time he returned to the Apache camp 3 days later, Jake had enough evidence to bring down the entire conspiracy. But he also knew that they were running out of time. Morrison's campaign was scheduled to begin in just 10 days. "We have to move fast," Jake explained to Chief Nailnish and the council. "I need to get this evidence to Santa Fe and, then, to Washington. But, even if I ride hard, it will take at least a week to reach the territorial governor." "And Morrison will not wait," Chief Nailnish observed grimly. It was Ayanna who suggested the solution, though it came at a personal cost Jake didn't fully understand until later. "The symbols can carry message faster than horses," she said quietly. "But it requires great power, and someone must guide the spirits who carry it." Jake looked at her with concern. "What do you mean?" "I can send your evidence through the spirit world to reach honest men in Santa Fe and Washington immediately," Ayanna explained. "But doing so will require me to use the last of my shared power. After that, the symbols will belong only to you, and I will have no connection to their strength. The cost of this spiritual message sending would be Ayanna's complete separation from the symbols that had defined her life since childhood. She would retain her natural intelligence and courage, but she would no longer have access to the supernatural powers that had made her special among her people." "I can't ask you to make that sacrifice," Jake said. "You not ask," Ayanna replied with a sad smile. "I offer freely, because the alternative is war and death for my people." That night, the entire tribe gathered for the most solemn ceremony Jake had ever witnessed. Ayanna sat in the center of a circle of elders, the evidence documents spread before her, while she chanted in the ancient Apache language and called upon spirits whose names had been sacred for countless generations. Jake felt the power flowing out of his symbols and through Ayanna as she wove the spiritual message that would carry his evidence across hundreds of miles in the space of a heartbeat. The sensation was both exhilarating and heartbreaking, as he realized he was witnessing the end of Ayanna's connection to the supernatural world that had shaped both their lives. When the ceremony ended just before dawn, Ayanna collapsed from exhaustion. The symbols on her dress had faded to simple decorations, no longer glowing with inner power. "Is it done?" Jake asked Chief Nailnish. The old chief nodded grimly. "The spirits have carried your words to those who can act on them. Now we wait and see if honest men still exist in the white government." They didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, a cavalry patrol arrived at the Apache camp, but, instead of attacking, they came under a flag of truce. Their leader was not General Morrison, but a federal marshal named Thompson who carried orders from Washington to investigate the allegations of corruption and conspiracy. Morrison had been arrested, along with Briggs and the territorial officials. The planned military campaign had been cancelled, and a new policy of negotiation rather than warfare was being implemented. The crisis was over, but the personal cost weighed heavily on Jake's heart. Ayanna had sacrificed her spiritual gifts to save her people, and now she seemed like a shadow of her former self. "Do you regret it?" Jake asked her as they sat by the stream on what he knew would be his final evening in the camp. "No," Ayanna said without hesitation. "The symbols were meant to serve the people, not the other way around. Their purpose was fulfilled. What will you do now?" Ayanna smiled, and, for a moment, Jake saw a glimpse of the fearless girl who had first saved his life. "I will live. I will marry Kiva, if he will have a woman with no magical powers. I will raise children and teach them that courage comes from the heart, not from spirits." "And the symbols?" "They are yours now, completely and forever. Use them well, Jake Harrison. There will always be corruption to fight and innocent people who need protection." As Jake prepared to leave the next morning, he felt the weight of his destiny settling on his shoulders like a mantle. He was no longer the broken, purposeless cowboy who had stumbled into the desert seeking death or redemption. He was something new, a bridge between worlds, a force for justice powered by ancient spirits but guided by human compassion. Chief Nailnish approached as Jake finished saddling Thunder. "Where will you go now?" "Wherever the symbols lead me," Jake replied. "There are a lot of corrupt men in this territory, and a lot of innocent people who need someone to stand up for them." "And, when you are old and tired of fighting?" Jake looked back at the Apache camp where he had found his true purpose and the closest thing to family he had known since Sarah's death. "Then, I'll come home," he said simply. As he rode away from the camp for what might be the last time, Jake heard Ayanna call out behind him. "Remember, Jake Harrison, Thunderbird for sky power, Wolf for earth wisdom, Eagle for spirit vision. But, most important, remember that their greatest power comes from the love you carry for the people you protect." Jake touched the leather pouch at his side and felt the warm presence of the three symbols. He had indeed claimed them all, as the title of his story promised, but, in doing so, he had also claimed a responsibility that would define the rest of his life. Thunder's hooves carried him toward the horizon and whatever battles awaited, but Jake no longer feared the future. He had found his purpose, his power, and, most importantly, he had found himself. The symbols had chosen wisely, and Jake Harrison would spend the rest of his days proving worthy of their trust. Behind him, in the Apache camp, life went on as it had for generations. Children played, elders shared stories, and young people like Ayanna and Kiva began building the next generation of their proud people. But now they did so with the knowledge that somewhere in the vast territory, a cowboy rode with ancient Apache symbols protecting him, carrying their values of justice, wisdom, and spiritual vision into the wider world. It was, perhaps, the greatest victory of all, not the defeat of specific enemies, but the planting of seeds that would grow into a more just future for everyone, Apache and white alike. The story of Jake Harrison and the three Apache symbols had only just begun.